Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. To put it simply, Odoo is built to save. Odoo saves time, Odoo saves money, but most importantly, Odoo saves businesses. That's right. Odoo superhero software rescues companies from the perils of disconnected platforms. And Odoo's utility belt of user-friendly applications puts the power of total business management in the palm of your hand. Learn more at odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, saving the world one business at a time. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And welcome to Third Parties Week. As you may know, throughout this election year, we are doing a few special series of election-related stories roughly timed to the election calendar. So earlier this year, we did a week on the also-rans, the people who gave it a shot during the primaries and didn't end up getting the nomination. We did Veep Stakes Week, a look at all the back and forth around the vice presidential selection. That was really an excuse for me to talk about those conservative cruise ship rides where everyone fell in love with Sarah Palin, one of my favorite stories. And this, folks, is Third Parties Week, a few episodes looking at notable third-party candidates and what the constant clamor for a third-party option says about American politics. So here, as always, two people who I would never box into just one of two options. They defy categories. Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And we have a very special guest for today as well, perfect for Third Parties Week. Dave Weigel, longtime political reporter, now at Semaphore, where he writes the Americana newsletter. And I would say Dave is one of the best chroniclers of the nooks and crannies of American political life. So if there's anyone who knows what it's like to try and find a home outside the two major parties, it is Dave Weigel. So, Dave, thank you for doing this, especially in an election year. I know you're running around a million places, so thanks for making the time.
Oh, thank you.
You know, we're going to do a little historical sketch here, and I'd love to get your thoughts, Dave. But, you know, I'm curious just to get us started here. And this is not necessarily a horse race question about this year's election, but can you, contextualize the appetite for a third party right now as you see it when you're out on the road talking to voters, compared maybe to other moments in political history you've covered or that you've studied? I mean, what are you seeing out there? What are you hearing? And how does it compare?
For context, I started covering these races on the ground as a job, as a vocation in 2006. So I was very active in the 2000 campaign. I was at a college newspaper, and I covered what was happening in Illinois, which at that point was almost a swing state, not really. And in 2004, I was at USA Today and watching it from the editorial room. So I paid attention, and my first elections, to put the context there, really from 2000 to 2012, you had pretty broad satisfaction with the two-party nominees, and that was an outgrowth of what is now, what didn't seem at the time, but what now looks like broad satisfaction with the two parties. They were two, I would say, mostly coherent, and they're more coherent now, but fairly coherent parties with factions that were on the Democratic sides more right-wing, factions on the Republican side that were more left-wing. But generally, the parties that nominated people might be bored with them, but they didn't have contempt for them. They were less divided. And I attribute that. I'm in the media, so maybe this is just me swimming and being a fish and not knowing what water is. I do attribute that to the way media has changed. Whatever you think about the old media, just if you look at what gets done in places where the parties are pretty normal and the media has shrunk, people are not out there with dark opinions about, well, we need a new option, a new party in Wyoming. We need a new party in Michigan. It is just the national conversation that I've been part of got a lot more bitter. And so you went from a period of people being not thrilled, but fairly happy with their nominees. 2008, very happy. Most voters were very content with the choice between Barack Obama and John McCain. To this very expensive, very atomized media environment where everyone ends up unhappy with their nominees. Even in 2020, if you look at final exit polls, Joe Biden had narrowly a positive approval rating. Donald Trump had narrowly a negative approval rating. But the discourse, and then even talking to voters then, there was a lot of discontent. I can't believe we have to choose between these people. That's definitely gotten worse over the years, and I think people have, in large part, done it to themselves by over-indexing their own interest in these candidates. And so I was long preamble to say, this year, let's all I'd say, about as bad as it was in 2016. The difference is that the Republican Party was much more divided about whether to support Donald Trump in 2016. That fed the coverage. You'd get a lot of interviews with Republicans who couldn't stand the guy. You don't get that anymore. In this year, you get dissatisfaction with Joe Biden that started in his party as this guy's too old. That's still the defining issue, which you can't fix. And changed after October last year into the left of the party being unhappy about Gaza. For those two reasons, you have more than ever interest in some alternative. But it just hasn't manifested in votes for an alternative.
Yeah.
Just you have more voters than ever saying, I'm unhappy about these choices.
Yeah.
Because the other sort of wild card here is who those choices are. You know, we are going to talk in a little bit about, in a future episode, about John Anderson as kind of this, like, a normie choice in between what was pitched as two extremes. And I think that there's not necessarily, like, a normie alternative or, like, a centrist unity figure emerging as a third-party candidate this cycle.
Yeah. It is funny, Dave, to hear you frame the first part of your covering politics or being aware of politics starting in 2000 as largely a time period where people are relatively satisfied with their two choices because, of course, 2000, we're going to do a full episode on it next, but, is one of the most notable third-party runs. But I think it tells you how far round the bend we've gone that you would sort of look back and be like, yeah, but even so, with Nader kicking around, people were largely playing within the parameters. But I want to kind of take a little tour through history and maybe try and lay out, as we often do in the first episode of these series, a taxonomy of who third-party candidates have been, where they come from, why they run, how they find traction throughout history. And so, we have come up with a few basic categories that we're going to run through. And then, Dave, I'm just curious, you jump in as you hear something that you want to go deeper on or have thoughts. But, we've kind of laid it out into three basic types of third-party candidates. And there's the issue-based ones. There's the person-centered ones, the sort of cult of personalities call it, and then there's the sort of pure protest dissatisfaction lane. And I think I'll just say off the top, every third-party candidate, especially the successful ones, meld all of those, but those feel like three interesting sort of lanes to pick up. So we want to start with this idea when we talk about a kind of real issues-oriented third-party candidate. Nikki, what are we talking about? Who are we talking about?
So those issue-based campaigns, they were particularly prevalent in the 19th century when there was a more robust third-party or alternative party universe. And so you would get these third parties that pop up around issues like abolition, around issues like suffrage, prohibition, free silver or greenbacks, like economic policy. And the idea here was that you could become kind of a conduit for a particular policy preference. And the way that it tended to work out, I'm not sure if folks approached it this way intentionally or not, but the way that it would tend to work out is that if your little independent third party, which was around one single issue, if it managed to attract a significant number of voters, then one or both of the other major parties would look at that and say, okay, so we're just going to suck this issue in and we're going to get those voters, and that's how we're going to kind of get past the post. And so, these still exist today. There are parties around marijuana legalization, around there's still the Prohibition Party is kicking around. They've nominated their person. I just want to read the last line of his biography on their page. He is a lifelong teetotaler and a lifelong abstainer from tobacco and other drugs. This is who you get for the Prohibition Party.
So, Dave, have you run into Prohibition Party supporters out there on the road?
I never have. I've covered a number of third parties over the years, and the one surprise this cycle, frankly, has been being reminded that some of these exist. So RFK Jr., who I think will be a future discussion, he has the nomination of the Natural Law Party, which started as a transcendental meditation-focused party in the 90s, did poorly, as you'd expect, in a few elections, and then just stayed in existence as this rump party in Michigan, the Reform Party, created in 1986. That still exists in a couple places. It's endorsed Kennedy, and I think that the one that he had to do the most explaining about is the American Independent Party, which started as George Wallace's party in 1968. That still exists in California, just because the reason that LA Times had a good story about this a couple of years ago that you can just keep rerunning. Just people think, independent. They see that on their list of options when they register to vote. They don't realize that it's different than no party preference. They register as American Independent. all of a sudden they belong to this right-wing party. It had no real leadership. It got taken over by different guys with no agenda, and they just nominated RFK. So he was on the ballot in California. So you've seen the third parties that do exist, the exception of the Libertarians and to a lesser extent the Greens. They can have this long half-life after they stop doing anything.
Yeah, they become kind of zombie parties.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the Republican Party in the 19th century, that's kind of how it gets its, genesis. It's like when you think about anti-slavery and the push for free soil, and then you get the Republican Party out of that, which was not like a long established party. It's a result of this, abolitionist stance.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to reiterate Nikki's point, and then we'll move on to the kind of person-centered approach, but it does feel like when there's one huge galvanizing issue, you can get a third party that's trying to carve something around that, and there's enough gravity. And, I think maybe certainly in the 19th century there were a number of those issues, and I wonder if just now we're so fractured that there isn't that kind of one thing that is the defining thing for every voter, essentially, and maybe that makes it a little harder
maybe
for
abortion,
third parties.
maybe.
But maybe, yeah. Okay. Let's cruise on to our second category, our rough category, which is the person-centered cult of personality. This feels like a lot of third-party candidates.
Yes, I feel like this is the bread and butter of a third-party candidate. I mean, like, when I think of cult of personality, I mean, in my lifetime, I think about Ross Perot because he was such a caricature on sort of the main stage. Like, people understood his sort of, like, quirkiness, and he's this millionaire at the time. But you think about how a lot of these third-party figures, they create an identity that people are drawn to. And a lot of times these identities are sort of like the common man identity, the farmer, the forgotten man, like maybe it's a religious sect like Irish Catholics, or maybe it's, people who live in urban environments, city dwellers. Like there are all these different ways that people coalesce around this common man, or sort of the underdog, if you will, story. Yeah. I think the underdog story is such a powerful, like, sentiment, particularly in an American context. Or if you think about like Teddy Roosevelt and like his Bull Moose Party, it's all about like this hyper masculinity where it's like, I'm as angry as a bull moose, which I don't.
But also a little underdog story there of like, I've gotten kicked out of the establishment and now I'm going to find my own path.
Yes. And it resonates with people because for people who do see themselves as underdogs in society or outliers in society, it speaks directly to their own, political stance.
So, Dave, I mean, I suppose this is where we can talk about RFK Jr.
Sure.
I mean, what do you make of this idea that a lot of these, especially modern candidacies, are built around these cult of personalities?
Yeah, well, thank you for giving me that long preamble, because that's the start of the RFK third-party campaign. It begins as a Democratic primary campaign. It's very clear that he's getting no traction in that primary, which, true to form, for Kennedy, he blames on a conspiracy against him. It's really just he is a... what's a nice neutral way to put this? Intellectually open guy who keeps agreeing to things on right-wing podcasts that are offensive to Democrats. That becomes his problem. He launches the third-party effort, and he's very smart about the branding. He if you watch his TV ads, he's only had one during the Super Bowl. There's no policy. There's not anything he stands for. It's just, aren't you sick of having to choose between two parties? I'm running as an independent to break that up. And the combination of that idea, and he will point to the same data as everybody else, the Gallup polling showing fewer people want to associate with the two parties, more people want a third party option. He takes this ball that No Labels fumbles away in the discourse and says, I'm the candidate who's going to offer that. And the Kennedy name, people know what it is. He often refers to his uncle. He refers to his father. He gets a lot, if you watch his interviews, a lot of fairly friendly interviews where people just kind of riff on things they like about the Kennedy. Mm-hmm. So he's combined really the urtext on the Kennedy campaign is by Karl Marx. That's a classic essay on Louis Bonaparte. That was about how in a time of crisis, people go back to a familiar name. That's kind of what Kennedy was banking on. The combination of a familiar name that you have nice associations with that will take you away from the chaos of having to choose between two unpopular parties. So for all the stuff he's talked about in this trail, that is his main appeal. And it's been chipped away a little bit as he's gotten attacks from Democrats. But that's the idea. It's not a, here I am to fix this problem. Now, it's really just, if you feel left out and annoyed by this system, you know my name and you know that I can bust it up.
Right. What kind of things did you write growing up? Did you write diaries or love letters or melodramatic poetry about the fate of mankind? And could you ever imagine getting on stage and reading those things in front of strangers? I know that I've basically memory holed a lot of that stuff, and no thank you, I am not interested in that. But luckily, plenty of people are, and the result is our fellow Radiotopia show, the Mortified Podcast. It is back with new episodes celebrating the 20th anniversary of the stage show that inspired the podcast. There's more laughs, more teenage writings, more awkwardness. In fact, Mortified is hosting its first ever Tournament of Teen Angst, where participants like this person compete for the title of Most Mortified.
January 12th. I keep looking at Matt, and he then stares at me. I wish he stared at me because he likes me, not because he knows I stare at him.
So go check it out, and congrats to Mortified, one of the OG Radiotopia podcasts, on this incredible milestone, 20 years of their live show. The podcast is really wonderful listening. Mortified, wherever you get your podcasts.
But that's interesting, though, too, because as much as RFK is pulling on his identity as a Kennedy, the Kennedy institution or family is kind of like, oh, like there's pushback even within his own campaign among his family members about how they feel about his stances.
Yes, they're very aware that the name is popular. They still, everywhere I go, I'm turning on some road named after JFK or named after RFK.
Yeah.
He does have that, but he's used that image to tap, again, not into to the extent he has a few big ideas, but there are not many voters, for whatever reason, whose defining issue right now is preventing another government intervention during a pandemic like we had in 2020. Like Ron DeSantis ran on it in the primary, it got him nowhere, and Kennedy offers that, but he's not running as the anti-vaccine candidate or the anti-COVID mandate candidate. He just talks about it as part of his premise that you need to just blow up this two-party system, and then you're going to have some freedom for new options. TBD. That is a very common there's a very common third-party promise.
And that sets us up perfectly for this third category. I mean, I'll just point out, kind of, it feels like you're so right to point out that there isn't really a cohesive ideology. The thing that coheres it, or the two things that cohere it, is one, the personality at the heart of it, which, as we'll discuss, the established parties have also, adopted that. But then also the protest, the notion of protest. And these are all related, but, let's talk a little bit about this idea of the third party vote as a protest vote, as a blow up the system vote, not necessarily voting for something, but voting out of dissatisfaction with what exists. It feels to me like a relatively modern phenomenon. Nader, I think, certainly talked a lot about that, even though he also had a very consistent he had a much more consistent ideology than, say, RFK Jr. How much do you see just pure dissatisfaction as the number one thing above all the other things we discussed, like policy or cult of personality or so forth?
I see more pure dissatisfaction. I do think, I'm not trying to soft pedal, I do think that there are more people, especially under 30, who are just dropping out of the political system because of various problems they have with government, I'm a media supremacist. I'm just not paying attention to the media that for the entire televised era of politics cover politics. People who might have paid attention 30 years ago and people who never really paid attention. There's always been a large population of non-voters. It got larger in the 90s and 2000. It actually has never gotten that low again. There is the bigger electorate than it used to be. But a lot of the electorate that came in is motivated by negative polarization or by appeals to them on certain kind of narrow issues. Now, in 2000, that wasn't the case. The economy was, people kind of forget, the economy had roared in the 90s. It was slowing down in 2000, then gets the recession after Bush is elected, very shallow recession. But the complaints at the time were just that there wasn't enough of a difference between the two parties. And this was a very, very shallow interpretation that took on because the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton did not do anything to tend to its left. It just really didn't. Mm-hmm. All the left-wing energy around opposing neoliberalism, opposing that wing of the Democratic Party, all that left-wing energy needs a place to go, and it goes to Ralph Nader. So Nader, at points in the campaign, is polling close to 10%, especially in swing states. His effects on the election, everyone focuses on Florida. That's the thing to focus on. That makes sense. But he changes the strategy of the Gore campaign because Gore actually moves to the left during the campaign. He has to compete for places like Oregon and Washington where there's a huge Nader vote among people who who are, in some cases, really intimately involved with the anti-WTO movement. On the right, not quite the same thing. I mean, the thing that happens every 2 terms of president, I'd say, is that people get a little more satisfied with what they have, and they want to win. Winning feels good, losing feels terrible, so they put some of their defense. You had on the right against George Bush, a Pat Buchanan campaign, an anti-immigration campaign that presages what Trump is doing, and it's oriented against Bush because Bush is pro-immigration. He doesn't want to dismantle the entire New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't have the same momentum with Republicans at that time. Really, all the energy is the Democratic Party's abandoned the left. And they don't have that problem after 2000. The same sort of problem until 2016. And even then, it's with a candidate who is appealing to the left, is just not trusted by them.
Yeah. I think that just to underscore 2 things that David said, to zero in on a big change that has happened. I mean, you do have this deep dissatisfaction in the electorate, but it has resulted in folks dropping out and then the people who are identified with a party clinging even more tightly to that party. So even though you have these very high levels of dissatisfaction, you're not seeing the same numbers for third-party candidates that you saw in the 20th century. Like Ralph Nader gets 2.75% of the popular vote. Gary Johnson gets about 3.5% in 2016. But when we're looking at the 20th century, like Ross Perot is getting, what do you get, like almost 19% of the vote in 92. Huge. John Anderson gets 6.6. George Wallace gets a big chunk. You don't have the protest and the dissatisfaction flowing energetically into an alternative campaign. You have a lot of dissipation out of
it's
politics.
Almost like instead of a third party, there's just no party, right? Is the option now. Yeah. Okay, I want to sort of take half a step back and ask a question now that we have a few of these lanes and have a little sense of history. In thinking about this, I was trying to think about kind of in my lifetime what effect third parties and third party candidates have had on the major political forces of my lifetime. And, certainly Nader. But putting that aside, I mean, the next thing I thought about was honestly like the Tea Party, right? And I was like, and this is a really interesting question of why did the Tea Party never run candidates under its own, maybe it did a few places, but why did it never really run candidates under its own banner? Why did it not become a full third party? And in fact, what happened was it sort of got absorbed and just had a huge influence into the Republican Party. Yep. And you think about Bernie Sanders, right? He didn't go and then run a third party. His job, as he saw it, was to influence during the primary process the Democratic Party. And so I'm wondering, Dave, if we're kind of at a point now where the sort of third party push is actually playing out more in the primaries and then absorbing into the 2 existing parties itself rather than breaking out into a third lane. Yeah.
Sanders is an innovator in that, but he's doing it at the same time that Donald Trump is. And so one of my biases, I think in general, in the press, a thing that alienates people from political coverage is there is this bias towards things are the way they are. Something is trying to change the way things are. Is that dangerous? And so the Trump and Sanders get some of the same coverage in 2016 because the Rolodexes political reporters are full of people who work for the party and frankly know how to make the government work if they win. They're people who work in think tanks or they're members of congressional staffs or members of Congress themselves, governors, and they kind of know, okay, just put the party in charge and can do this stuff. And so they were fine with the boundaries that existed in the Democratic Party at the end of the Obama administration, and Sanders wasn't. They were fine with the boundaries in the Republican Party in 2016. Their base wasn't. I want to get too complicated in this because Sanders rented a lot of anti-Clinton voters who weren't actually progressive. But in both cases, you had movements that absolutely could have just said, this party's broken, screw it, we're going outside of it. But they'd seen quite recently people try to do that and fail. Sanders had been courted by Ralph Nader in 2000, and he saw Jesse Jackson's 1988 '84, but also '88 when Sanders endorsed him. He saw his campaigns as much more effective. Jackson moved Democrats in his direction on a few issues. Yep. Nader didn't move Democrats in anything. They just resented him for spoiling the election. So he makes that choice. Trump, who'd flirted with running as a third-party candidate, he makes the same calculation. He was famous. Could he get attention if he had a press conference about being the Reform Party nominee? He could, but he leaves that experience thinking it's just a bunch of losers. And for Trump, a guy who cares about being genuflected to, he sees the difference when he goes to a Reform Party event and it's people who are kind of outcasts from politics, or when he goes to CPAC or Republican Party events, and there are people who used to be powerful who are genuflecting to him, and he sees, okay, I can win and change the country through this option. I'm not one of those people. That is a very popular idea that Trump was never trying to win. I think you don't do what he did unless you try to win. Yeah, they just make the calculation they can change the existing parties and not blow them up. The Democratic and Republican parties just were changed in 8 years. They have not reverted to what they were like before those campaigns.
Yeah.
I wonder if one of the big historical factors here then is also the weakening of the party as an institution. Like in the 19th and 20th century, the parties could kick you out. They could starve you of funds. They could deny you all of these different things necessary to win an election. And because all of those have been outsourced to independent and social media, to fundraising online, because the party's gatekeeping power is so weak, you don't have to leave the party. And there's a good reason to stay in the party, which is that structurally you have so many benefits from being able to claim to be a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Dave, as we wrap up here, I'm just curious, I know this is like the obvious question. I'm sure you get asked it a lot, but, do you see this shifting in any sort of way? Because obviously the appetite is there for something new, but as we've just discussed, maybe it's just being absorbed into the two-party infrastructure itself. But when you talk to Ralph Nader, for instance, I read an interview with him just from this year. It was really fascinating. And the main thing, first off, he says, like, the thing I learned was that the Democratic Party is really good at scapegoating people. You would expect him to say that. But then the other thing he said was what we really didn't do was build a sort of down-ballot infrastructure and build a kind of like there weren't local Green Party candidates really out there connecting to the national race. I mean, this is probably a good moment to name-check the DSA, the Democratic Socialists. I mean, there are hundreds of DSA candidates and DSA elected officials kind of up and down the political infrastructure, maybe not all the way to the Senate and presidential levels. But that is a party that has seemed to be really focused on building out a little bit more of an infrastructure. But in looking at the history, especially at the presidential history of third parties, it does often feel like these candidates are like lone wolves doing it once and then moving on and not really connecting to this larger infrastructure. So I'm curious, David, do you see a world in which there is an actual infrastructure that gets built, or a forceful enough lone wolf candidate to actually just carve out a third-party lane by force of will that really does affect the nature of our politics?
So that's why I started talking the way I did about Kennedy, is that he sort of sees his future when he captures these fringe party nominations, that without the scion of the Kennedy dynasty, who is very famous and well-liked by Joe Rogan, is there a leader of his movement? There isn't. I mean, is Nicole Shanahan going to lead a movement in 2028? I can predict. I don't like making predictions. I can predict no. That she won't do that. No, what they're all fighting against is just basic political science, and one party wins. They can win with a plurality of vote, and they can't fight human nature. They can't fight that losing is more fun than winning. And there are only so many cycles a party goes through, or a fringe party goes through, before it gets tired of not gaining anything and being scapegoated. The scapegoat factor is always very revealing. During the campaign, a third party nominee will say, "I don't care who I spoil it for," and their voters will say, "I don't care who I spoil it for." And then after the election, if they're blamed for spoiling it, they don't say, "Well, that's what I wanted. I said I was ready to spoil it." They say, "Don't blame me for what happened." So I don't see that. The openings I see and have talked to people about and covered are more changing voting systems locally, cities first, and states, so that third parties can win in a multiple round election or a ranked choice voting election. That is being opposed by both major parties, and I can't tell them what to do. I think the consequences of that are risky. I mean, having a safety valve where a city can occasionally elect a socialist alternative or a Green Party council member or a libertarian, where maybe they can win a state senate seat or something. If third parties channel their energy into that, I think the impetus just blowing up the system might be a little bit different.
But I'm really glad you brought up that notion of structural reform, because I do feel like there's a big appetite and awareness of that now. And, maybe the lasting legacy of this moment will be whether, more people drop out as voters or decide that kind of we need to reform the way that we vote. But, I'll name check this person because we're going to talk about them in a couple episodes. But that guy, John Anderson, who ran against Carter and Reagan, what does he do after he fails as a third party? He goes and founds Fair Vote and talks about ranked choice voting and so forth. And, connecting that third party run to then some structural reform that makes it more viable is an interesting part of all of this. All right, we're going to leave it there as our kickoff to Third Parties Week. Dave Weigel, this has been really great. Everyone should go subscribe to the newsletter through Semaphore. The last thing I'll tell you, just you can walk away with it. The one thing you can take from this is that, yes, the Prohibition Party is out there. They are running as a presidential candidate, Michael Wood, a fifth-generation CEO of a multinational company, and his VP nominee is a 63-year-old former postal clerk from Toledo, Ohio. I mean, if that's not the American ticket right there, I don't know what is. So, Dave, you should go track them down.
Oh, will do.
In your valuable time between now and November. All right. But, Dave, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It was great to do it. Thank you.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.